So we're going to talk about Angular 1 and 2. Feel free to just take a seat. There's pizza and soda over there. We're going to talk about 1 and 2, comparing them, showing you kind of what the changes are. There's been a lot of kind of thought around Angular 2. If you've been following it, a lot of people not understanding why things were changed or why they were changed or whatnot. Just for a quick reference, how many people have used Angular 1 in any capacity? All right, so you're all going to tell me that I'm wrong about certain things, which is great. But I will tell you why it's better in Angular 2. Quick little thing about me, Tony Gemoll, at Uber on Twitter. I'm an application architect at Northwestern Mutual, and as Stacy said, I organize this meetup. It's pretty much all the important stuff. So some background on my Angular usage. Had a role a couple years ago in 2013 where we started using Angular. Quickly dropped it for Knockout because at the time there was issues with IE7 support, and at the job I was in we needed to support IE7, which was painful and terrible. Not the hugest fan of Angular 1, which is kind of ironic because the first thing I did at Northwestern Mutual was help write the standards and reference app for Angular 1 usage at Northwestern Mutual. A lot of the reasons why is I've seen a lot of terrible Angular code. I've written some of it. After a while, it started feeling like I was writing just Angular and not JavaScript. So the other reason, like I said, is there's a lot of terrible, and it's because you see a bunch of controllers where you only have one controller and then 1,000 lines of code, and then your view is like 1,000 lines long. So when you see that over and over again, I kind of wonder if that's the right framework of choice or not. Also, there was a lot of going into the writing Angular code instead of JavaScript. There's a lot of Angular .module or mycontroller.this. There's just a lot of ceremony with Angular 1, which we'll kind of get into more as we go on. So some assumptions before we get started. If you're writing, my comparisons sort of assume you're writing a more modern approach to Angular with smaller code chunks, maybe multiple modules, maybe some would even call them components in your modules. I don't have any examples of like giant controllers comparing it to Angular 2, so it's more in line with kind of trying to use modern techniques. And then the Angular 2 examples assume you're using TypeScript or at the very least ES6, ES 2015. All right, so we're going to jump in. So we're going to talk about first, kind of starting up your app, kind of the differences between bootstrapping an Angular 1 app and an Angular 2 app. And bootstrapping is where you basically start everything up Angular. So Angular knows what's going on, can find your initial files, and then can start rendering your app. In Angular 1, if you're doing kind of a more modern technique, you might have a simple starting point app element in your index, and you might have an initial module called app where you pass in your router and your initial root level modules. Been kind of crazy. In Angular 2, it looks kind of the same. This might be the only code that is the same. And then there's a boot.js in Angular 2 where you pass in your initial component, and then some high root level providers, which we'll kind of talk about a little bit more. But at this point, these are components you want access throughout your entire application. So like the HTTP service, the router, and your routes. And we'll talk more about routes as we go further into this. So that's kind of bootstrapping. Pretty simple. So then we're going to jump into components. Components are basically small reusable pieces of your UI. So depending on how far somebody will take this, they may be like a login window might be a component. Some people might even take that out and have each line of the login window be a component. It really depends on your preferences, but it's kind of just small pieces of code that can be packaged and possibly reused elsewhere in your code. Or, and why this is useful is you kind of want to keep functionality separated from each other to keep maintenance, make maintenance easier and testing easier. So in Angular 1, if you look at the style guide, for kind of modern Angular 1, they suggest breaking this all out into different files. So you'll create your Angular module and call ours widget, do any configuration that you would need to do or pass any dependencies for that module. At some point, you'll create a directive telling Angular that, hey, this is a directive. You pass in your template string, your controller, and the name, your controller as name. And then, since we're using kind of a more modern approach, we'll just have a widget controller that is a class that does our work. And then, because of the string injection in Angular 1, you have to specify, hey, these dependencies exist. Foo should be right there. That's an error. And then you just export it. And string-based injection, by the way, is awesome. It's really fun to minimize it and amplify it. So in Angular 2, this gets a lot easier. So we have, what, 3 files? Plus maybe, if you wanted to, 4 files if you put your template in a file. In Angular 2, we drop down to 1, maybe 2 files. You see the same type of thing. We have the class come into here. Same kind of setup as we would before. And then the select, you'll notice this kind of weird syntax in a couple of spots here. This is a decorator. It comes along with TypeScript. And basically what this says is for any instance of this class, it has these kind of extra metadata attached to it. So it says this element property, or the selector for your component is going to be, in this case, widget. You're going to have some template. If you're using, say, Webpack, you can require that in instead of specifying your template in line. If you're using System.js, you can actually load your templates remotely. The next line is any dependent directives. So if you're using any child components, you would need to specify them here. And then any providers. And you'll notice, and providers are services or mainly just services. And you'll notice that it's not string-based. It is actually referencing the object type. And then here, you kind of see this type notation, which is TypeScript. And all it's saying is this variable foo is private, and it is type of type foo. And this is syntactic sugar for doing this dot foo equals foo. So it does, TypeScript will do that for you. Pretty simple. So next, we're going to kind of walk through binding and directives, where magic happens in Angular. This is where you either love Angular or you hate it. This is my opinion where a lot of the kind of fear, uncertainty, and doubt came into play, because they basically redid all of the Angular directives and binding. My initial response to this was, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing this? This is crazy. Now people have to relearn a whole new thing. And from my understanding, the reason for it is now that there are unique syntax for certain scenarios, the Angular team can optimize for those scenarios, whereas before, everything was assumed to be two-way bound, and they had to just assume it was going to be like that, and then do detection as they ran your code to figure it out. one other thing before I kind of explain the differences here and what's going on is Angular 1 was two-way data bound by default, which caused a whole bunch of performance issues. Angular 2 is no longer two-way data bound by default. Everything is one way, unless specified. So we'll get into that in one of these examples. So if we look at Angular 1, we kind of see the ng syntax, which a lot of people should be familiar with, ngIf, ngClass. The same type of stuff exists in Angular 2. It just has slightly different syntax. So like in this case, ngIf is preceded by an asterisk. So any directive preceded by an asterisk is known to manipulate the DOM. So ng4 or ngIf are two examples that will be hiding or showing things on the DOM depending on what is in the component's data. Next, we kind of get into changing classes. So you can still do == type syntax, but Angular 2 now has where you can bind directly to attributes on the elements. So in this case, class got yellow. So if this expression is true, it will put the class yellow onto that element. If it's false, it'll remove it. You can still do similar to this type of syntax if you want to, but you don't have to. The curly braces syntax, kind of the handlebars mustache-esque syntax is still there. So is the pipe or filter. However, a lot of the functionality from the pipe operator has been simplified. With Angular 2, there's only a handful of operators that will work on the right-hand side of a pipe. In this case, uppercase will make whatever value is in input value uppercase. So there is a new syntax for doing two-way data binding, say in an input field. This syntax is known as the hot dog in a bun, or a banana in a box syntax. I've seen both of them referenced. I believe Angular uses the hot dog in a bun name. And essentially what it's doing is brackets, or square brackets, are one-way data bound to the element, and the parentheses are one-way data bound from the element. So when you do both of them, that's how you have two-way data binding. And then the last one is click. So we have an event coming from an element, the click event, and we're pretty close to the same. You will notice that they removed the controller as. So you use, in Angular 1, you could do VM dot or whatever your controller's name was, dot, to kind of keep your code a little cleaner. I don't know the real reason for that officially, but with how Angular 2 renders, it by default will include your component selector. So it's really easy to know what code you're looking at, because like in this case, if the selector for this component was widget, it would be inside of a widget element. These are not all the differences, but it's the large majority of the ones you will see every day, or use every day. So now we're going to talk about scope in Angular 1. And, a lot of people are probably familiar with scope.apply. Scope.apply, that was fun. How many people have written scope.apply just to try to get something to work that was completely broken? So for those that don't know, scope.apply was used a lot for async calls. Because of how Angular 1 worked and figured out what changed, you may have been outside of a change cycle or a digest cycle. And if a value changed, Angular wouldn't know about it. So it happened a lot with async calls. So what you would need to do is wrap your changes into a scope.apply, which would most of the time tell Angular, hey, something changed. And then going in the scope.watch, so Angular had a lot of performance issues for large amounts, I shouldn't even say large amounts, medium-sized data sets. So if you were watching too many, had too many data elements in your components, in your controllers being watched for data changes, Angular 2, or Angular 1, because of how that detected changes, was kind of terribly slow. So Angular 2, that's gone. They removed it all. It's not there. In my experience using Angular 2, I haven't had any issue of Angular not picking up any changes that happen. They dropped it in favor for something they wrote called Zone.js. This is actually a package you can use on your own if you want. This is the elevator description of it. What it really means is Zone allows a set of asynchronous actions to be placed inside of a container. And when all of those asynchronous actions complete, the container will fire off an event, which Angular will use to know that it needs to update the UI. At least that's my understanding of how it works. So in this case, you can go do a whole bunch of async requests, come back, update your data as you normally would, and Angular will just know that it's time, that all your requests finished, and it's time to kind of update the UI. All right, moving along. Services. So going back to some of my issues with Angular is I would see, or Angular 1, is you would see controllers with like 1,000 lines long, and then they would have business logic in it, and then it would not, and that same business logic would be coded, in this other thing over here, which is kind of gross. So services are where it's suggested you should put your kind of business logic. In Angular 1, there's 3 ways to create a service. Because why not? Best part is they're all pretty much the same. They all create a service. The only real difference that I know of is some use the new keyword and are singleton, where others you return an object literal and does not use the new keyword. If I remember correctly, they're all singletons. I'm not sure because I mainly just use dot service. And I think even the style guide suggests just using that service. So we have a widget.js file that might have a module.service in it. And kind of using an ES6 Angular approach, you might have an actual widget class, which looks very similar, widget service, which looks very similar to a controller. We kind of have our constructor inject our string-based injection again, which is super awesome.
Tony.
Yeah.
How does TypeScript type that?
So this is Angular 1.
Oh, that part is too.
Yes.
Okay.
So it doesn't. Angular 2. Angular 2 services are just a class. You have a decorator, decorator, that basically lets the Angular dependency injection engine go, hey, this thing that I have can be injected into a controller or another service. And then it's the same syntax of TypeScript. We're going to pass in the HTTP service, call it HTTP, we're going to mark it as private. And once again, that's just shorthand for this .http equals HTTP. TypeScript sort of just does that syntactic sugar for you. Kind of nice like that. So services, kind of really easy. You just a class. Going to go into routing. A little bit. Routing is basically what components do you want to load when. So if you have a URL that's slash widgets, you probably want to load the widget component. In Angular 1, this is assuming you're using the UI router. The built-in Angular 1 router is not great from everything I've seen and have used. The UI router, which is, I believe, since merged into the Angular project. It's still an independent package, but is now under the Angular GitHub. Has a bit more features for child routes and better syntax, I believe. Kind of looks something like this. So when you create your widget module, you pass in your dependency of UI router, pass in your dependency on the state provider, and then you just specify your named routes. Because we were using a component model in earlier examples, we just set the template to be whatever the element of that component is, and Angular will load in the template inside of that. In Angular 2 is an interesting story. Before we talk about the code, is they're on release candidate 4 for Angular 2, which is interesting because in the last 2 months they have 3 different routers. They've deprecated one of them. They've basically stopped talking about the second one, and now they have hopefully the final one that's currently in beta. This is the current one. As far as I know, it hasn't changed. So you have kind of the key difference here is in Angular 1, the routes were attached to, it was suggested to attach your route to the individual components. In Angular 2, they have taken that and threw that out the window, and now they are advocating a central route file for all your routes. You will notice there is no more named routes, it is paths only. And you'll notice that it is no longer string injected or even using a template. It's an actual reference to the type of the, or the type of the component. Excuse me. We just export that using kind of ES6 syntax for modules. And then in our boot file, as we saw earlier, we're going to inject our routes as a provider dependency to our app when we bootstrap our app. How do you use your routes? In Angular 1, using the UI router, it would look something like this. You would just say, hey, when you click this link, go to this named route. Or when you click this link, go to this named route with these parameters. In Angular 2, that is no longer the case. In Angular 2, they have redid how you specify the route. It's a little bit more complicated, but it is more in line with HTTP standards and way more powerful. So like in a standard anchor tag, you would have an href of like slash wherever you wanted to go, so slash widget. So it's the same type of thing, but you'll notice right away that it's an array. It's because you can pass in each part of the link and Angular will build it. So in this case, to match this example, you would do slash widget and then the variable foo. And that will generate the correct link. It also means you can do more powerful stuff in that this doesn't need to start with a slash. It can actually be relative links. So you could do like ... and go back just one part of the URL and change it, and Angular will figure it out. You can also do like slash widget, foo variable slash some other constant string slash another variable, and Angular 2 will just build that out for you and figure it out. All right, so that's all the stuff that was changed between 1 and 2. With Angular 2, they've introduced kind of a whole bunch of new-ish stuff. The first being TypeScript. Love it or hate it, TypeScript is kind of the de facto Angular 2 way of programming right now. ES6 is close, but Angular 2 itself, A lot of the supporting libraries, which we'll talk about in a bit, are like Reactive Extensions, and some of the third-party plugins are all written in TypeScript and take advantage of some of these features. So TypeScript, if you've heard about it, we could talk about TypeScript for probably an hour session on its own, but its kind of key thing is it gives you types and type checking. At compile time, you will get errors that are, compile times you'll get errors that says, hey, this doesn't match anything on this particular type, or I have no idea what you're talking about. As we talked about earlier, Angular 2 makes use of the decorators, so component and metadata are injectable. There are a couple other custom decorators that it uses, but those are the main two. And originally I was not a fan of TypeScript because I was never a fan of CoffeeScript or Jade, or basically a lot of the things that completely rewrite the language and made me have to learn something completely new and JavaScript. So I was a little hesitant learning it, but once I kind of saw some of the tooling features that come with it, it's hard to go back. So some of the things that it gets you right out of the gate when you install the plugin, say in Sublime or WebStorm or whatever, is you get IntelliSense on your types, on your objects that actually works. Like you can do dot and see all the available properties. You get auto formatting. Something that has been promised in Angular 2 but hasn't been seen yet is the Angular 2 team internally, or Google internally, has a bunch of stuff for Angular 1 where they can auto-update all of their apps to the newest versions of the framework. They want to bring that to Angular 2 to help with keeping people current. And one of the reasons they will be able to do that is because if you're using TypeScript, they can reason about your code easier and understand it and automatically change your stuff. If you were here for the Ember talk a couple of months ago, it's similar to what Ember tries to do. My understanding is it'll be way more powerful because of the types. And so some of the examples of the tooling support. This is a sweet animated GIF I borrowed showing off the error checking. So if you show errors and you start making mistakes, they start showing up like, hey, this doesn't make any sense. We don't have these properties. It gets even more in depth than that. If you have a string and try to set it to an integer, it'll tell you that you're crazy and won't let you do it. The other thing that is really super neat and I use all the time is there's renaming that actually works. Because you have types, and Angular and TypeScript can reason about those types, you can have find and replace names across your entire app that work. So if you have, say, a student that has a first name and a person that has a first name, and you want to change one to just name for some reason, you'd be able to do that with basically a couple, or a key command and a couple backspaces and an enter. All right. So we're going to move on to the next new thing. So Angular 2 doesn't officially have a Redux store, but there is a third-party one that is written and is released with Angular. So Redux originally was a RxJs library. Its claim to fame is it was a kind of unidirectional flow of data, and it was immutable, and it centralized your state. So a lot of big words that basically means it was a global data store that you could send actions to. It would reason about those actions, update. It would create a new object of the updated for the update, store it, and it would fire off an event updating anyone listening that there is a new data object. The reason why this becomes really important in bigger applications, especially when you're going into the component model of developing software, is you need a place to, so when you start off, usually your parent components will start passing data down to its children. It's the same in Angular 2 as it is in React. And what happens is as you start sharing data, that data starts going higher and higher up your component tree. And what happens is eventually you're passing data all the way down and then inventing it all the way up, which becomes a headache really quick. So having something like Redux where you can say, hey, here's a new event, here's what changed. Redux creates the new object, stores it, and events it off, means that a component can just subscribe to the data that it needs and fire off events when that data changes. It makes your code a lot easier to keep track of. And the biggest thing is because the data is immutable, meaning that you never change an instance, never change the data that is stored, you always give it a new instance of an object to store, is when you do the updates in your components, is you don't have to worry about figuring out what field changed. You just take in a new object and go, hey, this is my new object. This is what, and then just render for that new object. You no longer try to figure out what field changed, so you know that you need to change this or that. You just look at your object and render it. Some links for more information. And once again, Redux is something we could talk hours on, and its versatility, but I want to throw it out there that this exists. It's not just a React thing anymore. The last major thing, and this one is likely to be, I don't know, it depends who you talk to, but the people that are fans of Reactive Extensions or RxJS are really excited about it and believe deeply that it's going to be like the next big thing. So much so that it's actually in stage 2 or 3 of becoming part of the JavaScript spec. I forget which one. So Reactive Extensions, Angular 2 has a hard dependency on it, means it's required. The router, the HTTP service in Angular 2, the Redux store, all return RxJS observables. And what it is so you've seen callbacks. I'm assuming you've seen callbacks. So you do some synchronous thing and you pass a function that says, when you're done, call this function. So there's that model. And then you've seen promises, which are kind of similar, but you pass in or you call a method and it returns you a promise that at some point in the future, it'll kind of return you data. RxJS is similar to those two, but it's more of a subscription to a data stream. So if you've done node programming and used streams in Node, it's very similar to that, in that you get, so for example, the HTTP service, when you do http.get to some URL, returns you an observable that you would subscribe to. When you subscribe, you get a method that says anytime there's new data, call this method. Which seems really simple, and like, why would you need this? Well, RxJS also has 140-ish, 120-ish methods that help you manipulate that data stream to make it more useful to you, so you don't have to do it. So to show you an example, instead of trying to describe it, is think today how you'd write like a Google or Netflix autocomplete box where you start typing and it starts popping up the results of kind of the fill-in-the-blank autocomplete for you. If you vanilla.js or jQuery, to think about how you would do that, is you need capture the event, you need to make a request, set a timeout because you don't want to make a request every time they touch a key. You need to set a timeout to wait a couple of milliseconds, make sure they're done typing, or at least stop to pause. If you make multiple requests, you got to keep track of which one's the current request so you don't show old or stale results. You got to cancel requests if you no longer need them, and then you have to update the DOM. So in Reactive Extensions, it's 6 lines of code, and that's it. So if we remove the lines of code for doing the AJAX request and manipulating the DOM, which are these last two, this is all you need. So the first line is you subscribe, or you get an observable from the key up event. The next line is just the map function. You take in the event that you are getting from the key up, or the event data you're getting. You just need the value, because that's all we really care about. We put a filter method in there that says if it's not over, if the text length isn't over 2 characters, just let it drop. We put it to bounce on there that says if it hasn't been more than 750 milliseconds since the last key press, let it drop. Distinct until changed is basically that. If the value hasn't changed since the last one you gave me, let it drop. Flat map latest is basically, if we've gotten to this point, make the AJAX request to get, in this case, Wikipedia results. And then what this is actually has a secret thing too, is if you get to this point multiple times and you're still waiting for results to come back, it will drop everything except the latest one. So it'll automatically cancel any previous call that hasn't returned. And then the last one is you subscribe to that data stream, and when you get data, you manipulate your DOM as you normally would. And that's it. There is a lot more to Reactive Extensions, but it is something that's worth a look. There's a kind of high learning curve to it. With all that said, if you choose not to use it, there are ways to break out of observables to go back to promises. So there is a dot. On any observable, there's a .to promise, and you can just fall back to promises if that's what your thing is. All right. So final thoughts. Getting into the real questions of this. A lot of people are probably wondering, does it perform well? The answer to that is yes. If you believe the statistics Google puts out, they are on par or better than RxJs in some tests, and on par or slightly worse than other tests. If you can believe that. I haven't done my own performance testing, but that's what they say. Right now, the gzipped compressed payload for Angular 2 is kind of large. I think it's, I don't remember the exact size. They are working on removing it, and one of the reasons it is so large is right now it deploys with the template engine. They're working on making a compile step so you can compile all your templates to JavaScript before you send them across the line. So it'll remove that requirement and also make your JavaScript a heck of a lot faster. The other question that we get a lot is there an upgrade path to Angular 1 from Angular 1? The answer is yes. I have not used it. You can, but what it is Google has made it possible to run Angular 1 and 2 side by side in the same app, depending on how you wrote your Angular 1 components. If you followed something similar to kind of the examples I've showed, you should be able to run them side by side. If they're like, I have a giant controller and a giant view, you're probably SOL. I have not used it. I will probably not use it just because I don't maintain any Angular 1 code. So that's all I got on that subject. And then in general, is it production ready? So the answer is yes, asterisks. There are things that are not done and or changing. So if you're okay with having some slight unknowns, like the router is currently in beta and has changed twice in the last 2 months, then I would say go for it. Everything I've seen with it has been fine. I haven't hit anything that has gotten like blocked my way any major roadblocks or anything like that. So I sort of answered this question, but a lot of people are probably wondering, but what about React? So there are, under the hood, there's a lot of differences between the two. But I jokingly boil down the differences between the two to which templating engine do you like better? And it's kind of a trivial way to look at it, but there's the React way with JSX, and then there's Angular 2 with like string-based templates and the NJ syntax in your DOM. Outside of that, there's, like I said, a lot of stuff under the covers that they do differently. Like they're diffing engines, and the one change is completely different. Really, my suggestion is to play around with each one. I think the difference between Angular 1 and 2 right now is kind of personal preference. If you were asking me between Angular 1 and React, I'd tell you React every day, and not Angular 1. So, all right, I'm out of stuff. Any questions? And I know I went over a lot of stuff. I get that. The whole point was sort of to show off kind of the changes and give people some visibility into what's coming, or I should say what's there. So, yeah.
What's the current browser support for Angular 2?
I believe it is. That's a good question. So in my day job, I only have to worry about IE11 and Chrome.
Good for you.
I believe it's IE10 or better. I think it's IE10 or better. So the way that we're using it, at least at NM, is we're using Webpack to compile it down to ES5. So whatever supports ES5, it should be pretty okay. Any other questions? I figured there'd be some.
Your examples were all based on ES6.
For Angular 2, they're all written in TypeScript. In Angular 1, they are ES6, mainly because if you went and looked on how to do Angular 1 right now, it would look similar to that.
I've never done anything with TypeScript. That lets you, it compiles down to ES6, or you get to choose where it compiles down to.
Yes, you can choose. Like I said, we choose to compile the ES5.
Okay.
Just because browser support for some ES6 features aren't there. That'll change, I'm sure, but especially with Safari, I'd like to, hopefully that'll change sooner rather than later.
How many of the customers ES7 already?
Sam? What version are we on? We're on ES7, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is already out.
Yeah, but ES7 only had like 2 things in it.
Yeah, it was exponentiation and add start.
ES8 looks to have 4 or 5 features in it. I don't know, if you go search for TC39 and look at the GitHub page, look for stuff in stage 3, right? For ES8? 3 is probably what's going to be in ES8. Yeah.
If you're compiling this, does that impact how you would use it as a compiler? Is it a tooling to the compiler, or just for using the browser tooling?
Got it. I use the browser most often because our workflow is using Webpack. So there's a build step, so you're not jumping into like debugging in your code. One of the things I left out of this is Angular 2 is opinionated somewhat, but will let you do your own thing, but they're opinionated in the sense that all their examples use system.js to do the module loading and the TypeScript compile step. With that, there is tooling support to do debugging inside of your app, or inside of your IDE. I don't use it because that's not my workflow. So I don't know how well it works. But I have seen people that use it. Anything else? Nope.
Isomorphic rendering.
Yes. Okay. So you may have heard of, what is it called? Is it just called isomorphic in React? Still called? That's what it's called. Thank you. You may have heard of universal apps in React land where they can render on the server. At least the initial page load, and then kind of hydrate your models and whatnot after the fact. If it's not there or ready for Angular 2, it is coming. There is an Angular 2 universal. I'm just going to answer the next question. So React Native exists, where you can write native code using React. You can write native code using Angular 2. Right now, using native script from Telerict. I believe there is another project to do basically the same thing that Teleric is doing with native script. And it's the same, if you've looked at React Native, it's the same type of thing where you're writing mobile elements instead of WebView UIs. And you get to keep all the Angular syntax, it's just your templates change. There is also, I don't know where this stuff is at, but during ngconf this year they were talking about Angular on IoT. I have no idea what that means, but apparently that's a thing. So it's, if you look at Ember, Angular 2, and React, they are working closely together, talking a lot, stealing each other's things. For an example, Angular CLI tool is sitting on top of Ember CLI tool. They basically made a fork, put their stuff on top of it, and shipped it. I assume at some point they will remove it, but right now it is a pure dependency of the Angular CLI, or the Ember CLI is a dependency of the Angular CLI. So that's pretty awesome.
Open source.
Yes. I mean, build on top of shoulders of giants, right? Sure.